What we're going to talk about today is just some tips and tricks and some walkthrough on how to approach designing Orchestrator runbooks with regard to Service Manager. I know that I've spoken with a number of clients and they've all kind of expressed concern because Service Manager is a very involved system, there's a lot of things going on there. Plus, Orchestrator is very freeform and there's a lot of ways you can do anything. And there's concern about what the best way to go about building runbooks in relation to Service Manager is. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to go through as a brief overview, talk about some of the challenges that are involved with designing Orchestrator runbooks for Service Manager, go through some steps to organize and plan ahead to cover that gap, and to go through some of the walkthrough itself. So when I think about runbooks for Service Manager, there's really two categories that come to my mind. We're either talking about runbooks that are invoked by Service Manager, in which we're putting them inside our service request or change request or some other process. It's going to be inside a runbook automation activity. We add that onto our ticket and we fire it off so that data is passed from Service Manager into Orchestrator and something happens. And then the other category is those that take action upon Service Manager, be it moving data around from one ticket to another or from one ticket to its activities, or be it changing status of activities or managing a process, any number of things that take action upon Service Manager. And of course, we can also have runbooks that are both invoked by Service Manager to take action upon Service Manager that go into both categories. But for me personally, I look at these two categories and it's a good way to approach the complications involved. So those sort of considerations involve the challenges that can be seen when designing runbooks for Orchestrator is a lot about order of operations. For those of you who have already built runbooks that interacted with Service Manager in one way or another, perhaps you wanted to put in that very frequent request of having self-service available to the end users. You want to be able to present that request offering to the end user that then automatically fires off a runbook to complete task, so you've got the process completely standardized, automated, and auditable, tracked through the ticket and Service Manager. However, the order of operations for that gets a little weird because when you're in, the method of invocation is going to influence the design of the runbook. To know how you want to build that runbook, especially when it's related to Service Manager, very much depends on how it's being invoked from Service Manager or in general. Plus, if you want to publish that request offering out to the portal, you've got to be able to map prompts. In order to map the prompts, you have to know what property to map them to. In order to know what property to map them to pass it into the runbook, you have to have the runbook configured properly already. And you can see how we're going to kind of go in a circle here. So another one of the problems is navigating the Service Manager data model. Like I mentioned briefly earlier, Service Manager is a very large, complex system. It's a very large data model, and data is stored in a lot of places. It's very functional, it works very well, but when you're navigating it with something like Orchestrator, it can be a little tricky because you have to be aware of that data model in order to find all the information you're trying to pull in if you're not passing it directly into the runbook. If you need that runbook to collect information from the request offering or from the parent work item, you've got to know how to navigate from the invoke activity out to that parent request, and then perhaps over to other activities, perhaps over to the user or the effective configuration item. And knowing how to navigate between those objects within Orchestrator takes a bit of knowledge. So it's a little bit daunting if you're not intimately familiar with Service Manager structure. You've got to be aware of how it's structured in order to collect that data. So the biggest, best solution to overcome both of these, especially the order of operations, is planning ahead. And I know it's probably advice that you're like, oh, well, of course. But in my experience, a lot of people don't plan ahead as much as they could when they go to implement these processes. They just dive right in and start adjusting things on the fly and having to spend a lot of time going back and redoing work and adjusting things because they're running into complications that makes them realize they need to change things they already did back and forth until they finally get to the solution. A lot of that time can be saved and made more efficient by planning ahead and really getting a handle on what you're trying to do, what's needed for what you're trying to do, and how you need to approach it properly. The biggest, best thing is going to be the very first step is all you need to build a process map. This is a standard ITIL and MOF recommendation. If you go out to the MOF documentation with Microsoft, they've got a template out there that you can use for documenting your process in a process map. What it allows you to do is quickly look at the big picture of here's this process. For example, here's this new user process we're going to look at. We know that stuff happens in this new user process. Accounts get made, accounts get configured, perhaps computers get created, added, people get added to groups, things get moved around. Stuff happens in this process. But the process map is going to allow us to quickly see how these steps relate to each other, what order they need to be implemented in, and also allow us to see who's responsible for what. It allows us to really easily see not just the big picture of the process, but more easily identify those smaller steps and allow us to focus on what's needed for those smaller steps. Plus, having the documentation means it's going to be a lot easier to communicate the process to others. Say somebody comes along and says, hey, this process, how are we doing this today? How can we improve it? Having that documentation already is going to be able to quickly show to your boss or to whomever is asking, this is what we do. Maybe it's a training scenario. It's going to point out to your new employees, this is what we do, this is how you need to do it, this is the order of operations. Having that documented from the get-go is going to help you design the runbooks. It's going to help you train your team as well as keep a solid documentation library. Another part of the planning ahead that comes along with building that process map is identifying what you need to know to complete that process, what you need to know, what data that runbook needs to do its thing, and then align that data with Service Manager's data model so you can figure out where you want to map things and how they need to fit together, and thus how you need to design the runbook in order to collect that information. So I'm going to hop over to Orchestrator here real fast and give you a quick show of what I mean. I think there we go. So we grab this new runbook in Orchestrator. I'm not sure if you guys have all seen Orchestrator before, so a really quick description of the layout. The left-hand side, we have kind of a navigation pane that allows you to structure your runbooks within folders, and then within each folder contain a selection of runbooks that are available across the top. The middle pane here shows the actual runbooks and the construction of those runbooks. And the right-hand side here is going to list all of our integration packs and all of the activities contained within them. So we can come down, navigate down to the Service Manager integration pack, and we can navigate through and see the various activities that are within that integration pack. And so anytime we're going to be invoking a runbook from Orchestrator or from Service Manager, the first thing we need to do is start by saying, if we want to pass data in, we need to define what that data is going to be so that Orchestrator can collect it. The very first step then is to bring this initialized data. What that allows you to do, by having initialized data at the front end of your runbook, when you sync this runbook over to Service Manager and you make a runbook automation activity template out of that, any of the prompts we configure on this initialized data step are going to appear within Service Manager as fields for us to map data to. Now, they need to be linked to one of the runbook automation activity properties on the Service Manager side, but there's a number of properties there that we can use to map. This is the primary way to pass data into a runbook. You can also use the runbook to collect data from Service Manager. We'll see that also in a moment. But to define the data to pass in, we simply create this initialized data on the Details tab, click Add. We'll just add the number of properties we want to pass in, and then we'll just name them something that we'll use to recognize it. So, for example, we'll say Runbook Automation Activity Grid. That's actually redundant, so I'll just put grid there. And we'll put this one as title, not title. And then another one we'll put in start date. And of course, we can change the data type of these from string to integer. For these one, I'm going to leave it a string. If we wanted to pass in, say, number of tickets, we could make that an integer, and Orchestrator is already going to know that it is a number value. So by having that in place, hopping over to Service Manager, once we sync this over, we're going to have those properties available to map. So that is one of the first things to think about, is how we're getting that data into Orchestrator and where that data is going to be stored inside the Service Manager side of things. If we want to pass it directly into the runbook, we'll need to have initialized data configured, and we're going to need to have the data mapped into that runbook automation activity. We're going to talk more about where to map things and the concepts around that here in a few slides. One thing I do want to mention, though, I made that that property on there for the runbook automation activity good. That is one that in almost every circumstance that you are creating a runbook that interacts with Service Manager, if you're going to need to pull data from elsewhere in Service Manager, perhaps a parent ticket or anything like that, you're going to want to pass in the runbook automation activity good. That way, Orchestrator will be aware of the specific activity that's invoking it, and you can key off of that specific activity to find out information of the objects related to it, which we'll see in detail here in a little bit. Diving back into our slideshow. So I mentioned that one of the steps of that process map is allowing you to identify the requirements. So by breaking down that process into the overall, I might have actually skipped the slide here, but we'll go back to it. By breaking down the process into the individual steps, it's a lot easier to see what the overall process is and what the steps are involved, so you can identify what's needed for each step. I'm missing a slide here real fast. Please pardon me. For some reason it's hidden. We'll go back to that. So for terms of this demo, here is a process map that we're going to go through, and this is the sample process we're going to be using when we go through our demo and walkthrough and everything. It is a standard new, well, it's made up by me, but it's meant to be a basic new employee provisioning process. It just covers from the start when a request comes in, either via an end user on the portal or via somebody in the console. However this request is submitted, we get a new request. Very first step is the creation of an AV account and exchange configuration for our new user, followed by a series of other steps, one of which has a secondary approval to allow access to this secure system. After those accesses are configured, there's a validate step, and it gets marked completed. It's very basic, it's very straightforward for purposes of this demo. But that's going to be the thing we talk about. So going into identifying the requirements, by having our activities laid out this way, saying that we have 5 different steps that we need to configure things for, we can break that down and say, okay, for each step, what do we need to complete that step? What information do we need to collect from the user? Well, we're going to need to know, name, employee ID, start date, whether they have access to this certain system or not, et cetera, which means we can then write that out. For our demo, here is our 5 steps: AD account creation, secure system access, et cetera, and the pieces of information that we're going to be needing for those in this demo. Breaking it out like this, we're able to look at it and actually say, okay, which ones have the same information needed, which ones don't. We can then consolidate a complete list of what information is needed overall. At this point, this next step is to figure out where we want to map this in Service Manager. So to go into the Service Manager data model sum, I'm going to hop in the Service Manager authoring tool, which I neglected to open up before this. Unfortunately, it'll take a second to open, but while it's doing that, we can chat. The authoring tool is very useful because it allows you to get into behind the scenes of Service Manager and see what the actual properties are for any given class, how they relate to each other, as well as what the relationships are between the classes, all of which is information that is useful in order to collect that information from Orchestrator later. So when we look at the data model, we're going to see that there are numerous properties built in that we can store information on, especially with regard to the runbook automation activity. I'm going to hop back into here. Another slide actually talks about this. Figuring out where the best place to store that we're getting into right now. So we've got a couple different places that we could store information. One main idea is on the runbook automation activity itself. Like I was mentioning, it has a number of built-in properties that are designed for collecting generic data to pass into Orchestrator. This can be very useful, and a lot of times, depending on what your process is, how many questions you have, etc., this can be the easiest way to use it. By having it on the runbook automation activity, you're going to be able to directly pass that into the runbook as needed. The downside is it's going to be a little bit more difficult to review that information inside the console by looking at the runbook automation activity itself. Additionally, there's only so many properties available. If you have a very long, complex process, you might need more properties. This might mean extending the runbook automation activity class to add more properties onto it. It might mean extending out the parent work item or custom activity. That goes to our second two activity items on the parent work item. Parent work item, of course, contains a lot of information: title, description, assigned to user, etc. All the standard service request or incident information. The downside, though, is that unlike the runbook automation activity, there aren't any properties behind the scenes out of the box that can be used purely for mapping data. So if you have questions like employee first name, employee last name, employee start date, there's no real good generic property on the parent work item to map that to. You would need to extend because when you map properties, they don't get additive onto the properties within Service Manager. Whatever you map becomes the whole value of that property. You can't map multiple questions of the same property. You have to map each one to its own property, or else it's not going to work. You might lose data. So if you want to map it to the parent work item, you want to extend out that class to have some of those generic properties to store data on. The upside of this is that having information on the parent work item would mean that all the information you're looking for is already there on the parent work item. All you need to do is create a link in Orchestrator from that runbook automation activity out to that parent work item, and then you can get all the information you're looking for in one place. The downside, though, is that, yes, it requires a class extension, which is a fairly easy process, but additionally, that parent work item is the front thing people are going to access inside the console. The more you extend it, the larger you make it, the more data needs to be loaded each time that ticket is opened, which means it's going to be a little bit slower performance. So it's kind of a trade-off there between balancing out the extensions and making sure you're not creating a negative effect on the overall system performance. This is one of the reasons why what I usually do is use a custom activity. I have a custom activity class that I use inside, that we're going to see inside this workflow, what it is it is a custom class that simply allows you to have a bunch of generic fields on it, similar to the runbook automation activity, but has a form along with it, allows you to easily see all that information, and is a consistent place that anybody can know, here's the information that's mapped from the portal. The downside is that it's another hop away from the parent work item from the runbook automation activity, so it takes a little bit more work in Orchestrator. We're going to see some ways in a moment, though, to see how to streamline that. So going into talking about the custom activity that I have in place, I've got it called the additional fields activity. Makes sense? It's an activity has additional fields. It's a center for the manual activity, which means that I'm inheriting the manual activity form as well as the tasks, which means somebody can come in, mark it completed, mark it failed. I don't need to have automation connected to it. That being said, I've got another Orchestrator Runbook configured to automatically complete any activities of that go into an in-progress state, so that nobody needs to worry about manually handling those. They simply exist as a storehouse for information. And on the Extensions tab, we'll see all the different information that I have mapped to it, or that I have extended to it that can be mapped. And because of the fact that it is a custom activity, you only need to add it to a process, be it an incident or a service request, when you need those fields, meaning that it is minimizing the performance impact because you're not extending out the parent request. Also, you're not adding in additional things that are always loaded in every single request, only the ones that you need. So This is a slide I'm going to actually talk to in a minute. This shows, again, that consolidated list of information along with where I'm mapping things within Service Manager. So hopping back over, the authoring tool is going to be open now, and we can come over and look at that Runbook Automation Activity class to see the various prompts available on it once the authoring tool decides to cooperate. If you're unfamiliar with the authoring tool, it's a component add-on to Service Manager that allows you to get into some of the behind-the-scenes area, look at a lot of the internal information, as well as look at a lot of the, create your own custom classes, extensions, etc., as well as form customizations. So when we look at the Runbook Automation Activity class definition, we can see a number of properties that we're already aware of, but as we go down, we can see we've got these properties down here: Booleans, datetime, integer, long text, short text. What these are just generic properties that are on that class that can be used to store information. We've got 15 combined text fields between a long text and short text, plus 5 datetimes, 4 Booleans rather, and 5 integers. If the number of prompts you have for your process is that number or less, if it fits into the field on the Runbook Automation Activity, it can be the quickest, easiest way to do it is just map all of those onto the Runbook Automation Activity and not worry about it beyond that point. However, if you have more questions than that, or if you want to just have a consistent thing, you always have these additional fields activities, custom classes, etc. I'm going to load up a template for one of these that I built so that we can see what it looks like. And my demo environment seems to be going a little bit slow this morning. I apologize. I am running this entire thing on a laptop, so that does happen sometimes. So here is my additional fields activity. As you can see, it inherits that manual activity form off the bat. But I also have an extensions tab, which is very similar to the Runbook Automation Activity fields. We've got a couple of custom bools, custom date times, and a number of strings, both short strings and long strings. It's very similar. It's just another solution that can be used. The benefit of the additional fields beyond the field count is that if we need more fields than what's on one activity, we can add on multiple activities, just adding on the fields as needed for that specific type of request. So this comes in. If we look at the configuration within Service Manager for those request offerings and the actual mapping of those prompts, I'll hop into the template for the process we're going to walk through and build. There's that step for mapping prompts, which allows us to look at all of the properties on that given class and see where we want to map things. So on that Runbook Automation Activity, we've got, by default, just text 1 showing up in here. The reason only text 1 shows up here and not the other properties is because the runbook that this is linked to only has one property in the initialized data. This is actually linked over to, I'll pull up the runbook in question. It's linked over to this one, which, as you can see, just has one property on it. And if we look at the template for that in Service Manager, which we'd need to do to have to close this out to do, we can see it only has the one line there to map information to that runbook. As such, we only have the one property showing up here right now. But we can display all properties, and it's still not going to show the others in this case because we only have the one mapped. If we go to something else, display all properties will show us a slew of other properties as well. We can come in here and select what property we're mapping it to. Obviously, we can't map this, though. We can't actually configure the request offering and the mappings until we have the runbook created, so we know where to map things, so we can have a template created in Service Manager, so we can actually get into the request offering configuration. This is why I was talking about planning ahead to the order operations, which is why we're getting to the stage where we want to plan the mappings between the prompts we want to ask and the properties within Service Manager that we are going to relate these to. So I'm storing each of these on the runbook or on the additional fields activity, except for the manager option here. I've got listed on my note sheet parent work item related configuration item. Reason being for that, what I'm planning to do in the request offering is instead of giving the user a field just to type in the name of the user that we can say is the manager, I'm actually wanting to have them select the manager from a list. That way they can have that manager related to the ticket, and an orchestrator can grab that manager, grab all the information, and pull additional information for that manager without having to worry about any potential spelling errors or mistypes or anything like that. It also gives the opportunity to show in Orchestrator another way to hop another different hop between different activities or class types to grab additional information. So once we have this mapped out, we can start building our runbooks or runbook. Now I want to talk about some quick Orchestrator best practices that are going to be really key into building out this sort of automation. The best recommendation I can ever make for you regarding Orchestrator is to build your runbooks in the mindset of reusing them. Instead of building one runbook that has everything you want to do for a given process and just having this one thing, it's nice and big and gorgeous, and then each time you want to do something similar, you have to recreate the whole thing over again, build a bunch of smaller runbooks in reusable pieces and then invoke them via parent process runbook. This way you're able to reuse your work. Instead of having to reconfigure how to hop between the different class types in Service Manager each time, we can just have pre-configured runbooks that we built once that say connection from the runbook automation activity to a parent service request. And then any time that we need to make that hop, we just drag in an invoke runbook task with that links to that runbook, and we've already got all the configuration squared away. You don't have to worry about rebuilding that every time. We're going to see that in detail here in a moment. So diving in to the demo completely, I'm going to hop over to Orchestrator. This right here is a high level of the final runbook that I would be using to manage that process I showed you earlier. Pull that back up so you see it again. The idea being that some of these activities are going to need to have information from the parent request, so we want to configure a runbook to populate information down to the activity specifically so that anybody working on the activity does not need to go out to the parent request to collect information. Additionally, these activities may or may not need to happen depending on the user input when they submit the request. So we want to build in something in Orchestrator to turn these activities on or off as needed. One of the benefits of Service Manager's process management capability is being able to map out these processes via its template and manage the workflow. One of the limitations to it, though, is that you aren't able to do branching paths within Service Manager. That's an area that Orchestrator comes in, where we collect the data in the request submission and then can use Orchestrator to manage this process to turn activities on or off as needed. So what we're doing in our demo is building a runbook to do that. I'm going to kind of run through it really quickly to account for time and more to show you the things that were built. Note that these first couple steps, well, the first thing we're doing is this initialized data. Again, all we're passing in is the runbook automation activity GUID. Because I'm storing all the information on the additional fields activity, not on the runbook automation activity, all we need to know for this instance of this runbook is what is the exact ticket that this runbook is meant to affect. In order to do that, we pass in the RA activity GUID. That allows Orchestrator to be aware, okay, here's the specific activity we're talking about. From here, it can reach out and grab the specific service request and the specific additional fields activity and specific users, etc. And you don't have to worry about potentially returning information from a bunch of other tickets. So all we're doing is passing in that one GUID. The very first thing we need to do is get that parent service request information. So what I'm doing here is an invoke runbook activity. Like I mentioned, this is a link to another runbook that actually grabs that information from traverses that path between the runbook automation activity and the parent source request and returns all that parent source request information, so we don't have to worry about redoing that work each time. That specific runbook looks like this. Down in my Get Parent Work Item Runbook folder, we've got the basic layout, initialized data. Again, all we're passing in is that runbook automation activity GUID, because all we need to know is what the runbook automation activity is in question. From there, we pass it over to a get relationship that's going to span that relationship between runbook automation activities and service requests based off that GUID and give us every single possible service request that is related to that runbook automation activity. Obviously, we don't want every service request in case there are multiples. We only want the one that is the parent to this runbook automation activity. So we've got the link configured to limit that down to just, it excludes every service request that is not on the contains activity relationship. What this allows us to do is just identify the specific parent service request and grab that exact one, which we can then do a get object, in this case get parent SR, to grab that specific service request, and we can return all its information. I've got a little bit of error checking in here, returning. If it fails, it returns a false command that I then key off of in the parent runbook. Alternatively, if it's success, I've got it configured to return all of the information from that service request. So this is designed that I can use this sub runbook anytime I need to get information between a runbook automation activity and the parent SR. Any process I need that jump, which is going to be pretty much all of my runbooks that I invoke from Service Manager that are going to be relating to Service Manager in some way, I can reuse this work. I don't have to rebuild this each and every time. I've configured it once. It's good. Since I have that, I can hop back, and we can see that we now have all of the information on here. If we hop into the next runbook, we can look at what's returned from that previous activity, and we can see all of that SR information that we care about is now in that parent process runbook. So next step, we want to grab the information about the users connected to that parent SR. I've got a runbook here for grabbing the affected user information, and then one for the related user information. Both of these structurally are very similar to that first sub runbook. We can come down here to get connected CI folder, and we can see here's our runbook for get the SR affected user. In the same way that the previous one grabbed the relationship between a runbook automation activity and the service request identified as the parent, this one is grabbing the relationship between a service request and an Active Directory user based on that specific service request we pass in, limits it to the affected user relationship, and then grabs the affected user information, and again returns all of the affected user information. Same thing for the related user. It's using the related CI relationship, and it's just grabbed, but it's looking for, again, Active Directory user or group, and passes back all that information. So because I have these configured, they're nice and easy. They're there. I can use them whenever I want, wherever I want. I've got the links between these configured off of is success equals true, being that custom is success value that I was populating back in the return data, so I can control the flow. And then the fourth invoke runbook is actually connecting to that get additional fields and grabbing its information. This one I have slightly differently. If we go down to it, we can see that we have a very similar start. We're using the get activity actually, which instead of using the separate get relationship and then get object, it's another activity within the Service Manager integration pack that specifically gets activities that are children of the parent request plugged in. So it allows us to skip a step, which is useful, but in fact it does the same thing. We look for additional fields and activities that are related to the parent object passing in, which we then, when it finds it, we return success along with information. If it doesn't find it, we return failure. I have the second branch here that moves through because I've got those two date time values on here. And I want to be able to return not just the date time in the standard Service Manager format, the YYYY-MM-DD-THH, etc., etc., etc. I want to transfer that information back in a more user-friendly form. So for each of the 2 custom date time values I have on there, I have these steps that simply grab the value of that date time and then format it into month, day, year. I have the links between them to configure so that even if these activities here fail, this branch moves along and the runbook succeeds, plus this as a success path going directly from the additional fields to the return success, which is linking information, so that if there are no date time values mapped to that additional fields activity, this step or both will fail. But the overall runbook will still succeed. And if there is data there, they'll get formatted to a nice user-friendly format, and we'll have that available in the parent request, the parent runbook, because we have all of these data types being passed back. Now, this sort of thing, when you're building this, is important to realize. Well, this one's a sub-runbook. It's not as important, but when you get back up to the process level and we want to start mapping things, it's very important to realize what those properties are going to be. Because we haven't built the request offering and service manager yet. We haven't actually built those mappings. All we have is our list saying, okay, this is what the property is. This is where we're going to map it. We need to know that so that when we come here into Orchestrator and we want to move that data around, we know which property we need to be keying off of at which point to route that data. So after this point, after we collect that information, I've got a whole lot of little steps here that unfortunately weren't really good for making sub-activities in this case. Not a whole lot of reusable structure to these because they're all doing unique things based on this specific process. So notice that once we got the repeatable stuff out of the way, we now have the process-specific components to this runbook. First thing that comes off of here, note that I have the additional fields activity last in this order for a very particular reason. I mentioned inside the process we have activities we want to be able to turn on and off. To do that, we need Orchestrator to basically flip the skip property on those activities to true or false. Every activity has a property called skip. If you skip it, then Service Manager simply marks that skipped and anything inside of it skipped and brings that outside of its process workflow. It's the easiest way to handle these things. We want to turn them off is just to skip them. But in order to skip them, we need to have a path that is able to key off of the value of whether or not we are skipping them. And Orchestrator, when we have branching paths, those are configured on these links. The links are only aware of properties on the previous activity. So because we need to branch off those paths at this point to say whether or not things are skipped, we have to do that branching immediately after we collect the information which has this skip or pass information in it. Which means in this case we need to have the additional fields last after we've gathered all the other information, so we don't have to repeat these, but before we start doing things. What those look like, we've got those 2 questions over here. Secure system access needed, yes or no. VPN access needed, yes or no. When we hop over here, we've got a branch for VPN access needed equals false and secure system access needed equals false. What those actually look like from a configuration perspective, they're going to include any time that this is a success, but they're excluding any time that custom bool 2 does not equal false. Why custom bool 2 in this case? Because we're talking about the VPN access needed, and we planned on mapping that VPN access question to custom bool 02. The benefit of planning in advance shows its head again. So we can exclude anything that does not equal that, but allow through the instances wherein it does equal false, so that we can then grab the activity, and actually configure the skip. Now, one more thing I need to talk about here before I go into all of these little activities I have is the structure of the template within Service Manager. So one thing we can do before we do this part, or at least need to plan out, is how we're going to build this template in Service Manager. When we look at the process, we want to relate this to how Service Manager's activity structure would contain this information. So for those of you not familiar with Service Manager, we're actually going to look at the template in there in a moment, but Service Manager has activities within the process for service requests that allow you to structure that flow, not just in a linear fashion, but allowing you to do concurrent activities as well as nested chains of activities. So really what we're looking at here is high level, one big chain with one parallel activity sitting here that forces these 4 branches to happen simultaneously. And then because this branch has more steps than the others, we're going to need to put a sequential activity in to have this be a nested branch of itself. The reason this is important is because knowing how that template is going to be structured is going to be vital in building the runbook as well. Again, planning in advance, figuring out how the process is being mapped so you can figure out how it needs to be built in Service Manager so that you can then configure Orchestrator correctly. You can then go back and finish the configuration in Service Manager and publish it out to the end users involved. So looking at that template over here in the Service Manager side, here is the template for that request. You can see that once it opens up, that we've got some information filled in already, including assignment information. We've got the activity chain in place, but we don't yet have everything we're going to need over here. So we've got kind of part of a title. We've got a title here, but it's kind of got a dash after it, leaving things off. That's because we're going to map some information on there, which we'll see in a moment. The main thing we're going to look at is the activities. Again, we're looking at that same structure as the process, though built out into our Service Manager form. We did add in a few additional steps in here, which we're going to talk about from a structural perspective. Whereas over here, we go straight into the meat and implementation of creating that account, creating these accounts, validating review, and out. We want to have that additional fields activity to store information. We want to have an activity to invoke our management runbook. And the other activity we're going to want to use to invoke a runbook that fits right in here, because some of these need the Windows username information, which is discovered up here. So we're going to have Orchestrator populate that after the end. So when we look over in Service Manager again, the overall chain, we've got our additional fields activity. We have over to list view. Additional fields activity, our invoke the process management runbook that we're looking at right now. The step to actually configure the AD account and mailbox, a step to populate out the Windows username and activities, our big parallel activity with all those steps beneath it, and then our validate step. So these runbooks here, these activities here, can't actually be put in until after the runbook is made, which is fine. You don't need them in here when you first design the template. We can delete these out. I'm going to not save this for demo purposes, but showing you how we can delete this out, and we can add after we have finished. Basically, we come in here, we build this part of the template. We've got our additional fields activity, we've got all of our actual implementation steps. Once we configure the runbook, we can then come back in after syncing that runbook to Service Manager, find the template for that runbook, drag it in, create it, configure it. The quick configuration for it is just showing that we have that RAA activity GUID property in the initialized data, and we have it mapping to the property ID of the runbook automation activity. For those following along at home or planning on doing this, this is actually something I want to point out. The ID property of that activity is not under the runbook automation activity list of properties here. That's going to be where all of the custom RAA properties are at. Rather, it's going to be under object ID. If you go to activity and any of the sequence ID or child ID, not going to be the one you're looking for. If you go to work item ID, also not going to be what you're looking for. The work item ID is going to be your SR12345 or your RB128224, but you want the GUID, not the front ID. That's going to be the object ID. By mapping that, That's the key to passing the information in so that Orchestrator is aware of what activity we're looking at. So once we have this over here, we can drag it back into place, and we can configure that afterwards. So since we know how that template is going to be built, or we might have built that template knowing what the titles of activities are, what the structure of activities are, knowing that we're going to have a parallel activity in there, a sequential activity in there, above our actual implementation manual activities, we can now come back to Orchestrator. And that's why we have these get parallel activity, get parallel, because we're navigating through those activities to get down to the ones we want. This goes back to the planning ahead and knowing how that process is mapped and building that template in advance. You've got to be able to navigate that data model, which means you need to know how things are structured. You can build a runbook to pop around that. So among the things we have spawning off of this additional fields invoke activity, one of them is just grabbing the parent SR, which we already have the info from over here, and just updating its title. Personally, I find that for a lot of workflows, especially new hire type things, it can be very useful to whoever is working a ticket to be able to look into their list of open tickets and see not just new user provisioning, but actually see, oh, it's a new user provisioning, here's his name, here's when he starts. So in this runbook, that's what we're doing. We are grabbing that parent request and we are adding onto it the value of the name of the new user and the start date, so it's all right there, easy to access at a glance when looking at that ticket. Note that the very first line in here points out, grabs the SR title from that invoke runbook. So we're, instead of replacing the value of the title, we are appending to it. This is done by having the title in here and then having other things placed after it. And as, I don't know if you noticed, I just did, apparently I have a typo in there. Oh gee, I'll have to fix that for the next demo. But so we're going in there adjusting the title. We're then also going over to that first activity. Because the service request template has that first AD account creation activity immediately below the parent request, we don't need to go into any other parallel activities or anything first. We can hop directly down from the parent SR to this AD account creation activity. That's what we're doing with this first step here. We're grabbing, using the get activity from the integration pack again to grab any manual activities that descend from that SR. It's only going to grab manual activities that directly descend. It's not going to traverse the parallel activity boundary. We can grab that manual activity, but it's going to grab all of them. So technically, it's going to grab not just this, it's also going to grab the validate and review because it's also a manual activity descending directly from the SR. It's actually also going to grab the additional fields activity as well, which is why we want to then filter on that line, including any cases where the get activity succeeds, but excluding any cases that are not identified as the unique activity we want. In this case, I'm keying them all off the title because the title is going to be inside the template, and the template is going in the request when it is submitted is going to fire off this runbook before anybody else has a chance to come in here and change anything. We know the titles are going to be the same. We know the title is going to be what we want them to be. So we can key off the title. We've got this one here excluding any manual activities wherein the title does not contain the AD account. AD account, it's going to allow it through. So it grabs, so this allows us to grab just that specific manual activity and then update it with the information we want. The information I'm adding on, we'll see, is very similar throughout all the activities. I'm simply taking the existing description and appending a bunch of information beneath it. So we're grabbing all the information we collected from the various activities and from the related users and all that information and dropping it in so that whoever gets this activity, they're going to see in their email all the information they need without having to dive into the system or go out to the portal or any other bits of work. they're going to have parent request information, who requested it, what their name is, as well as their domain username, description of the parent request, who the parent request is assigned to, information about that new user, who the new user's manager is, and information about permissions. That's just a big chunk of information I'm going to be dropping into each of these activities. Each of these paths follow a very similar suit. For the others, because they are below that parallel activity here, we have to first do the same get activity, but instead of looking for manual activities, we're getting a parallel activity and then filtering that down to the parallel activity in question. I actually was a little bit lazy when building this runbook because even though there's only one parallel activity in this template, so I didn't bother adding in link conditions to specify this parallel activity. If somebody were to come back later and add another parallel activity in here, this would burn me because then I'd have problems. So better practice would be to actually add these link filters in on the parallel activity as well. From that parallel activity, we go off two more paths, manual activities and that secure system access sequential activity. Because we have beneath that two sets of activities, the manuals and the SSA, or the SA, we go two different paths to grab those. The secure system access, I have to grab the sequential activity, and then beneath that, I grab the review, the manual activity and the review activity, and then add information to them. Functionally, it's configured the same way as the top branch, but it just has extra steps to navigate the data model. Down below, because the parallel activity goes straight to those manual activities, we're going to have one activity that grabs all three of those manual activities, and then three different link conditions coming off of it that, just like we saw above, filter down to just the manual activity that we want. And then it goes ahead and adds the information to those activities the same way that we saw on the first manual activity. So really the key takeaways from this part is that having everything planned out in advance and is going to allow you to more easily map information and know where things are going to be stored, but also it's going to define how you build this runbook to collect the information. Additionally, building your runbooks in a reusable, repeatable fashion is going to speed up the time to create your runbooks by making them more efficient and making your work more efficient because you're able to reuse old information. Once we have this first runbook configured, we can then sync it over to Service Manager. That's done via the Runbook, the Orchestrator connector. You can see I have two in place in my environment here, one that connects to my production folder string and one that connects to my test string. It's going to grab all the runbooks I have, bring them back over to Service Manager so that we have those runbooks. The next step, once we have it synced, is to create that runbook automation activity template that we can then put into our service request template so that we can then build the request offering. So this one is this runbook. We can see the option on the side to create a runbook automation activity template. I've already created one, so I don't need to create a second one unless I wanted to have a different pre-configured set of information being passed in. But here is the configuration of that runbook automation activity template. It's got the title just being invoke name of the runbook, so it's very clear what it's doing. We can see right here it is linked to that runbook, and we can see all of the properties that were on that initialized data appear here, and we can configure the mapping. Once we have that, we can go into the actual rest of the service request configuration. We can go back to our service request template. Like I was mentioning before, drag in those runbook automation activities to the appropriate spots inside the folder or inside the activity chain. And then we can go over to the request offering configuration and configure the runbook to actually map information and put it where we need it to be in order to fire off that runbook appropriately. So this is the final step that knowing those mappings comes in handy, because this is actually where we make the mappings. We define the mappings at the very beginning and then built up everything off of where we're going to map things, and then at the last step we finally map them. So inside here we would create down to the place we want to map them, in this case additional fields activity, and we're going to remember which properties we have mapped to which questions, and then find the property, find the question. Configuring questions up top. For those of you who have not configured a request offering before, my apologies for not going into it in more detail. Basically, you start off by defining the questions you want to appear on the portal. You are able to put in configuration for those properties or for those questions, and then you map them to properties within Service Manager. One thing I wanted to mention also, I mentioned early on that the manager I'm linking to parent work item related configuration item, which we saw how we collected that information within Orchestrator. To actually see how we're configuring that within the request offering, we come down here to select manager, and instead of being a text prompt, we have a query results prompt. What that allows us to do in the configuration side of things, back to the manager, go in the configuration, and it's going to be a class picker similar to when configuring a view or a notification or anything like that in Service Manager, wherein we're going to select what class we want to be returned by the query and what the criteria is. So what the query results prompt does out on the portal is allow you to present objects from the database out to the end users so that they can select those objects directly. For example, in this case, a manager. This could be a computer or a database or anything like that. Any sort of objects you have tracked in the database can be exposed via the query results prompt to the end user. We just come in here, select a class. In this case, we want Active Directory user. Note that it's not in the default list, so we hop over to all basic classes, and we go down to Active Directory user. I'm apparently blind right now. Here it is. And then we configure the criteria. By doing that, I actually unconfigure it, so we go back in and look at the criteria directly. One thing that we have configured in ours is that we have, in our demo right now, there was a question before the manager that asked for the user's department. And if you remember, that's one of the pieces of information that we were actually looking for inside the request offering, or inside the information about the user. So we're asking the department. We're actually using that value also to select which manager is coming up. I'm going to clear these off for right now and just have user department equals the department value supplied. What this is doing is it is limiting the users that are going to be returned by that query results to be only other users who are inside that department, who have the same department value as the one we're selecting. The reason I'm doing that is to make sure to not expose every user in the entire environment to the end user, so maybe the ticket on the portal, but also in order to make sure that we're only loading so much information right off the bat. If we did not have any criteria in here, or if we didn't have anything connected to a previous question using tokens, when we looked at this query out of the portal, somebody loads up the request offering, it's going to immediately load objects out of the database, which is going to be a little bit slower time to load that page in the portal. Depending on what type of object you're loading, that may or may not be significant, but if you're wanting to speed things up, it's very useful to key these query results prompt off of another question, which then allows us to go out to the portal. Once we have this whole request offering configured, that's still loading, and look at just a subset of the users. Once we select the user and put in the criteria, we're able to select which columns want to be exposed in the portal. This is useful too because any of the columns that we expose can be used as tokens in subsequent query results. So if we wanted to string together a series of query results out on the portal to collect a certain specific amount of information, we could do that by having multiple queries keying off of each other. So portal up yet? There we go. Perfect timing. So this request out here on the portal, I have underneath my account management section. We can go into our finished request now that we've completed it and saved it and configured it and saved it. Go into the form, and we've got all the prompts we were asking, all these questions that we were asking here in the initial consolidated list, all the information we're going to collect out of the Orchestrator, we now have exposed to the user. We'll put in our description information. I'm going to submit one real fast. You can see this runbook in action. It is checked in and ready to go. So what's going to happen is when we submit this ticket, we're going to see Orchestrator or Service Manager is going to invoke the runbook, and it's going to grab all this information and populate it in specific activities within Service Manager. So note right now, here's that query results prompt I was talking about. Right now, it's empty. Once we select a department, we can come up here to medical, hit refresh, and apparently there's nobody in medical. Oh, actually, I didn't save the criteria change, so it's not going to show up out there yet. Let me go back and do that. I need to clear those off because they were experimental and didn't actually work in the configuration. I need to tweak that some. We'll go ahead and let that save, and we'll refresh the request offering page. I know we're getting low on time. We're near the end. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and submit them in webinar, and we will address them momentarily. Request offerings do take a moment to save. That's always a fun bit, but it'll be saved here in a moment. There we go. All right, now we can refresh this. We'll fill that stuff out again. Oops, down here. Note, by the way, that this did not turn out of red because I have it configured to require at least 20 characters. There we go. Now we'll go down to medical, hit refresh. We've got our list of users. Here's our chief officer. Go and select them, add them on. Start date, we'll say next Friday. Why not? We'll say they don't need access to that, so we'll have that activity skip. But we will go ahead and give them access to this system, and we'll say they do need VPN access, and we'll put in some other information. We'll review this. Looks good to me. Submit, and we've got an SR created. So it's going to take a minute for Orchestrator for all the workflows to trigger off. So we're going to get to see what it looks like now as well as what it looks like after the runbook hits it. We can see right now the request is created. We can see the activities in here. Nothing yet in the action log. Currently in the new status. Nothing going on yet. If we hop into Service Manager and look at this exact ticket, we can see our ticket here. It has now entered the in progress state. So Service Manager's workflow engine has started to work with that. We hop into it and see that as of right now, Our additional fields activity may or may not be completed yet. It's still in progress, so Orchestrator is going to be completing that here in a moment via this runbook right here that then fires off this runbook. But if we go into any of these activities, right now we can see that we don't have all the additional information in here yet. We just have the default information. Everything is still pending. Nothing is skipped. Nothing is in progress. If we go into the additional fields activity, we can see the information that we supplied sitting there nicely on the extensions tab. And we'll go ahead and refresh this. All right, so that's been marked completed. The runbook activity is getting ready to go. And right now, while we're watching this, it's a great time to ask any questions if you have any. So you can see the runbook is in progress. The runbook activity anyway. We can see that it has successfully invoked it. We actually hop over to the Orchestrator web console to see that runbook in action. Here is the instance that is currently running. Check out the details on it. We can see it's currently invoking that first runbook. One of the benefits of this view from Orchestrator is actually going to show us at a live, real-time pace what the runbook is doing. So as it completes this invoke, it's going to see right there, it moves on to the next one. It's going to move on, move on, move on. We're going to see a lot of activity as it gets through. Some of the other benefits, by the way, to having the sub-runbooks and using invokes is for memory optimization of the runbook. Whenever Orchestrator invokes a runbook, whenever it goes into in progress or whenever it's started, the entire runbook is loaded into memory, which means the larger the runbook is, the more memory that's going to use. It means that it's one of your best practices is going to be to have smaller runbooks that invoke a lot of runbooks, so you're bringing things in and out of memory and not overutilizing the server at any given time. Additionally, if you're going to have a runbook that's going to be constantly on and monitoring, all it should be is simply a monitor and an invoke, so that when the monitor's situation is triggered, criteria is triggered, it can then invoke the larger runbook. The larger runbook doesn't have to be brought into memory until such time as it's needed. The same thing works with Service Manager. When the runbooks that are invoked by Service Manager, they will not be started until such time as Orchestrator or Service Manager invokes them, which means they're only loaded into memory when needed. We're almost done with this runbook here. It's going to fly through the next part. I'm going to go ahead and close this for a moment so we're not failing to load information because we have it open already. All right, so after it's completed that, it's now going to hop off on a bunch of these simultaneously. Because we had one of the skip paths turned on and other one turned off, we're going to see that this one here is now in a pending state and this one is being ignored because it's not needed. Whereas we also have the next activity here in progress, and up top these ones are also in progress. See, it's moving right along. All of these just got completed. All of those got completed. The whole thing is completed. We can hop back now, we'll refresh this, and we'll see that new employee provisioning is now new employee provisioning Franklin. So you've got information right there off the bat. We can go into the activities and see that this one did get skipped successfully, just like we configured. And if we go into any of these other activities, we'll see we now have a whole slew of parent request information available to us in here. So it was successful. We have both invoked a runbook from Service Manager, and we have managed Service Manager via that runbook. And we've talked about how to approach doing that via plenty of planning and foresight, and just making sure we're mapping out what needs to be done, identifying the requirements before we go in and do it to make sure we're maximizing our time usage from the get-go, as well as maximizing the efficiency of the runbook. We've got the sub-runbooks being used. I know we're right on the end of time. If anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to say, please feel free to ask now. I do hope this has been useful to you to see a lot of this. I know we went through a lot of stuff really fast. Only an hour and 15 minutes. We can do what we can. As a follow-up, there is one more runbook I have in here that I briefly mentioned but didn't go into great detail on due to time. So this first step is meant to be in my demo little process, somebody coming in and manually configuring the AD account. I could have it linked to an automatic process to do that in Orchestrator. For this demo, I didn't. But for this demo, it's a manual step. And the last step of that would be to come and drop that completed username into this follow-up runbook. What this follow-up runbook does, it's configured very similarly off the bat in that the initialized data allows them to put in the runbook automation activity GUID, but it also asks for a field for a Windows username, which we can see over here in Service Manager on that activity. We've got the GUID already mapped. There's our GUID sitting there. We also have a username that we don't have a value for. We can type it in. We'll say F. Franklin and hit OK. And what's going to happen is once the previous activity is completed, and this one's allowed to go into in progress because I have it marked is ready for automation, this runbook's going to fire off and it's going to populate that Windows username to all of the other requests. I got an error there because it actually was updated by the workflow engine before I did anything. We're going to refresh that and pull up. See, now this is in progress. We'll go ahead and put this back in here. Save that. Mark our manual activity completed for demo purposes. And that's going to then go through and invoke this runbook, which will then populate that Windows username out. We'll be able to watch that. It'll take a minute for it to launch probably, but we can come over here and see if when it shows up before we run out of time. Actually, it's already going. So this runbook, as you can see, is structured similarly at the start. We start off with a get parent activity or a get parent SR from that same runbook we used in the last runbook. From there, it's going to bounce through those activities and add the username. What this runbook looks like inside the console, again, is just what you're seeing out there. See how fast it races through, if we have time to see it complete or not. One thing to note is that when we are traversing the bounds of activities and objects in Service Manager, it can be, quote, slow, unquote, to go through it all. And I say that in quotes because obviously it varies, and it's still a lot faster than having a person do the work by leaps and bounds. So it may not be as immediate, but all right, so that completed. We can hop in real quick before we have to tie this up. I'm getting motioned at here. Quickly hop into one of the sub-activities, and we'll see that at the very end of the description, now we have that Windows username populated, so it's available to the other people. So this has been considerations for developing Orchestrator Runbooks for Service Manager. Hopefully it's been very useful to you. We talked about planning ahead and how to approach traversing the data model and design the runbooks and keeping track of the information in order to properly both invoke runbooks from Service Manager and create runbooks to manage Service Manager.